Season 9 sure is on break, so I'm not going to have any new episodes to talk about for the next few months. Well, besides the bonus episode, but I also don't especially care. Anyway, I have full videos on each of these in case you want more elaboration on anything. Not especially much has changed since then for any of them, but I do have the tradition of doing a ranking of the first half of the season when it goes on break, so I'm going to continue to do that. Now, some of you might think that this is a dumb decision given that I have 6 absolutely massive videos to get done on already completed seasons and that I could be working on those instead. As I'm writing this segment, Boba Fett vs. John Yaosha has only been out for a few days and I still don't much care for it. I enjoyed it decently enough, but for it to follow the rest of the season's bangers and end off the first half on a kinda limp note really disappointed me. There are a few cool shots here and there, with 2 of the melee combat bits looking really good by Blender Team standards. I like all the first person perspective shots and the opening sets the atmosphere really well, but man, the fight's peaks just don't match any of the other episodes in this season. About the biggest positive I've realised since my initial review is that Boba Fett is given exactly 5 lines of dialogue to match the original trilogy. That's really cool attention to detail, but that alone isn't going to carry the episode past the decent enough tier. There are other episodes of this season which start off similarly mediocre if not worse, but the difference is that those episodes at least have the decency to have some great endings. This episode though has John Yaosha stop in the middle of a scythe swing because he's a moron, the animators forgetting for one shot that lightsabers are hotter than fire until they remember like 2 seconds later. Then John Yaosha is barely hit by the lightsaber and immediately starts playing low tier God's advice in his head. Funny thing is, the storyboard showed that John Yaosha was supposed to get cleaved almost in half by the lightsaber, but the animation doesn't convey that well in the slightest. He just tries to explode himself to summon an even bigger weapon like he did twice in the fight already. I can get using this explosion as a means to pretend like he always had his sword, but how the hell did he whip out the plasma scythe during the thermal detonator blast? If the analysis was strong enough, I could have maybe bumped this episode's score up, but it is still painfully unfunny to me, especially relative to everything else this season that came before it. Honestly, out of Boba's 3 episodes, this might be my least favourite. Not that it's worse than the first Fett vs. Samus, because it isn't. It outdoes that episode in production value by basically every conceivable metric. But that one's at least nostalgic and much funnier. It's not funnier for anything intentional, but they say "That's right, Boomstick" twice, which makes it my favourite episode of all time. In Fett vs. Samus Round 2, I just find a more solid episode in most regards, even not taking into account the Monty tribute at the end. The analysis is way funnier, the fight's faster and more fun, and I really like how it works their conclusion into the animation. Fett was more powerful and cunning, but didn't have the means necessary to catch Samus, so Samus evades him for most of the fight while whittling him down, but the one hit she does take because Fett lured her into a trap turns out to be the most impactful hit landed in the entire fight. That's what they say in the conclusion, and it's conveyed really well. In this one, they say Fett's ranged options would help him even though he gets outgunned pretty easily, his jetpack would help even though that's taken out almost immediately, and he would just escape the self-destruct even though the way the fight frames it implies Fett just takes the self-destruct head on and is on his merry way. Overall, it's still a good episode. The cool stuff in the animation is still pretty cool, but there's a lot of silly shit in this one, and I think that made it not quite as good as it could have been.
Batman, magic crystals!
Scarlet Witch vs. Zatanna is in a very similar boat to Aquaman vs. Namor for me. I expected it to be mid during the waiting period, then the episode came out and I loved it on my first watch. Fast forward to now though, and I definitely think I might have given it too much credit initially. It's still really good, don't get me wrong, but I think an 8 out of 10 rec in April was kinda pushing it a bit. And now that recency bias and the shock of the episode actually being good have worn off, I've kinda mellowed out on this one. It's still good, like I said. I'd struggle to put this in the bottom 5 if it came out last season, but it's not exactly a highlight to me. The analysis is still solid all throughout. I especially like how exasperated Wiz sounds when listing out their powers. Ben adding some of his signature singer spice to those deliveries, love to see it. Learning about their powers and histories was pretty neat, and I like the underlying difference in tone between Wanda being portrayed more as this eldritch terror who would threaten the Omniverse if she went off the deep end, while Zatanna's played more into her being a fun and playful showwoman. It's a neat bit of contrast that's also mostly pretty well reflected in the fight, except when Zatanna gets into a heated gamer rage at the start. Other than that, Zatanna keeps a level head while Wanda's undoing is her losing her own sanity, so it conveys the deciding factor of the fight well. Besides that, yeah, my comparison to Aquaman vs. Namor wasn't just limited to the waiting periods. Both episodes have a solid analysis and a really good ending to their fight, but what happens up until then isn't especially interesting, and it's mainly carried by the DC character being super fun and charismatic compared to the Marvel character having the charisma of a damp rag and the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk. This is still better than Aquaman vs Namor, don't get me wrong. I've heard Wanda's flanderized, but she's not as piss irritating as Namor. The visuals are overall way better, the track's a lot more atmospheric even if I'm not super into it outside of that, and it has the Superman punch which is better than anything for most of the fish fight. The rest of the start still isn't up to much, the chains in the summon battle are kinda lame honestly, but as soon as we get the Megamind reference and Zatanna reaching out of the screen, it's all uphill from there. It has some wonky pacing with Wanda snapping way too quickly, but holy shit, the delivery on her screams in Zatanna's final No More Witches bit are great. And that ending shot still gives me life. Thankfully people have only been slightly annoying with it rather than drilling it straight into the ground. I still like this episode a good bit. It isn't actively fucking up in any major areas for the most part, but with half of the fight being kind of a non-event, the peak's not quite matching some of the others this season, and it having the Batman vs Iron Man problem of bringing up all these cool powers for the fight and then using very few in any interesting ways, I can't quite say I loved the episode like I did on my first viewing, which kinda sucks, but a 7 out of 10 ain't bad at all.
Piss off, Ghost!
Vegeta vs Thor is another episode I gave an 8 out of 10 initially that's since dropped below that score. Not much has changed on the analysis side of things, it's still pretty good and easily the best that either of these two's gotten on the show, and Thor got faster in the end, so how could I complain? It's certain aspects of the fight that have begun to bother me a bit more, the least of which is the dialogue. I like when they got original lines, but there did come a point where both characters started to feel a bit like quote dispensaries. I like how Vegeta's bit about feeling fear flowed into the next few lines, with Thor saying that he only feels thunder and Vegeta gets another quote where he says that all he'll feel is oblivion. But I still think that treads way too similar ground to what Shadow vs Vegeta covered back in season 1, while also being a fucking stupid line in a vacuum. Vegeta has seen firsthand that gods in his world feel fear, so it feels way more shoehorned in than it did against an artificially made being like Shadow. Thor's Infinity War quote also feels way less natural. It's not something that applies to comic Thor at all, and really does feel like it's there for the sake of the reference with nothing to prompt it. But my biggest issue with the episode is the choreography and pacing. Let's go through how the fight progresses. Vegeta's losing in base but doesn't immediately die somehow, goes blue and starts bodying Thor, goes ultra ego after one minor inconvenience that barely counts as a hit, no-sells a few attacks, ragdolls Thor some more, then Thor goes Warrior's Madness, matches Vegeta blow for blow, knocks him down and then is able to kill him in 2 hits after he's exhausted himself. A lot of this just feels like Vegeta wailing on Thor, with Thor not doing much himself, and the abilities being thrown back and forth aren't interesting enough to pick up the slack. This is the only fight this season where I call the choreography outright bad, though I still can't bring myself to say the fight is bad overall, because it is still very well animated. The feeling of speed is incredible, the sprites and backgrounds look great, the voice acting's good, especially Lanny as Vegeta, and Princess of Pride is one of the season's best tracks. So yeah, I can enjoy most of the fight well enough, but it is really kept afloat by being nice to look at and listen to. What's happening on screen may be really dumb, but the presentation is strong enough to where I can still enjoy myself. And then we get to the ending, which honestly picks up any slack the episode had before, because it is incredible. In spite of Thor's weak-looking God Blast, the final flash that follows it is one of the best parts of the season. It's the one bit of huge scale in the animation. Lanny's scream is so well delivered that if you told me he was being stabbed in the recording booth, I'd believe it, and the fake out that it leads to is on a level that Madara vs Aizen wishes it could reach. Following that is one of the rawest hand-drawn shots of the show, a super nasty kill that I loved, and one of my favourite final shots to an episode we've had recently. No quirky one-liner, no pretending like the fight was hardly an issue, just a battle-damaged Thor screaming in victory as lightning fires down from the sky, saying more than words ever could. So yeah, in spite of the mostly pretty rocky choreography, I still really enjoyed this episode. It may have dropped down in score, but being one of the highest 7 out of 10 episodes to me is still a pretty good place to be in.
Monkey.
Yep, still don't want to spend much time talking about Heracles vs Sun Wukong. Eggshells are not fun to walk on. Analysis was super interesting to learn about them both, but could have used less Goku. Fight was a lot of fun with the narration and aesthetic making it feel super unique and immersive. Voice acting was on point, the Hydra joke still makes me laugh. The big stick shot was great, but the ending's still kinda bad, not gonna lie, Wiz. That's 2 characters this season that the boards show being cut through the left arm and the fight doing a very bad job at conveying it. If you really want to hear more of my thoughts on this one, then this is the one time in the video where I'm just gonna direct you to the dedicated review I did. Because as much as I love this episode, I do not love talking about it given how some people have reacted to it.
Harley did actually lift the whole 60+ ton tree off the ground.
Now, this is where the order starts to get a bit trickier to decide. Everything up until now had been pretty clear cut for me, as was my number 1 pick. but the three-way race for second place was fucking fierce. Putting any of these next 3 episodes at number 4 out of 8 really doesn't feel like it does them justice. But in the end, Harley vs Jinx drew the short straw. This episode has honestly only gotten better and better the more I think about it. I said back in my initial review of it that it would probably climb up to a 9 out of 10 in the future, and that turned out to be true. I love both character rundowns here. Harley's was a lot more interesting than your typical DC character. I liked hearing about her arc of going from a villain to an anti-hero to eventually a full-on superhero, and her getting her emotional state somewhat together and patching things up with folks is even reflected in Jinx's rundown. Speaking of which, the one thing I hear consistently brought up as a negative for this episode's analysis is the quote-unquote League of Legends ad, and to that I really have to wonder what the fuck any of you are talking about. I really don't get that criticism. Ringmaster was already part of the episode beforehand, and with his voice actor Billy being a super huge fan of League, it makes perfect sense to make that part of his character. He isn't actively promoting the game, he's going into Jinx's applicable arsenal from the perspective of an experienced player, and the fed up ways that Wiz and Boomstick respond to him are pretty funny. I really don't get why people dismiss this as just an ad. God forbid someone gets excited talking about something they like. Though I do know some people just don't like Ringmaster, which is fair enough, but I don't mind him. And then the animation really doesn't have much weighing it down. There are a few slightly floaty movements, the models clash a little, and Harley summons her lost hammer a few times out of nowhere, but that's really about it. This is still a very fun fight that brings out a lot of their weapons for a super high octane and surprisingly funny fight with some of the best visuals the show has ever seen. For every visual gag that doesn't quite fully land, there are plenty more to pick up the slack that still make me laugh even after several rewatches. The signature blender hand-to-hand combat jank is practically non-existent, and the camera work makes a lot of scenes feel way more dynamic, the carousel one in particular. The choreography is also always able to stay fresh and exciting, bringing in new weapons whenever another one has served its purpose already. And the ending is fantastic. The sketchy hand-drawn visual effects, fully playing into Jinx's madness, how she would counter Harley's mind games and toxins, all while ratioing Joker vs Sweet Tooth. The final explosion also looks really nice. This should be the go-to for how to do an explosion death correctly. Man, I don't know what else to even say. This is a phenomenal season premiere. It still doesn't quite surpass the holy trinity of Yoda vs Mickey, Dante vs Bayonetta, and He-Man vs Lion-O for me, despite definitely being better than them in a few areas like the visuals. But much like with the episodes this season, the race for second best premiere is super close, and putting any of them in fourth just feels wrong. It kinda sucks that this episode has kinda been forgotten as the seasons come out, because I saw everyone hyping it up as probably the best premiere when it dropped, and now it feels like nobody talks about it. Still, I love it a lot, and if this isn't even in my top 3 of the first half of the season, then that speaks volumes of the quality of this year's episodes.
If I'm a dog, yo.
Ableist.
Tanjiro vs Jonathan has taught me that the versus community doesn't know there's a difference between something being able to be improved and something being outright bad. I get if the goofy JoJo tears and abrupt pacing distract from the ending for you, but I don't get them ruining it outright. It's still a surprisingly powerful emotional beat that plays into JoJo being a really nice guy, and Tanjiro's stalwart determination to protect his sister until the very end. Just have like a few extra lines where JoJo asks if he's broken Tanjiro free from Nezuko's mind control, Tanjiro to deny that he was mind controlled at all, and then JoJo asks him why he would defend a monster of his own free will. Then you can have the ending play out the exact same way, and I think it would have been even stronger. But as it is, this is still one of the stronger ones we've had lately, and that is saying a lot. Other than that, this episode's pretty damn amazing. The analysis is super fun and got me interested in both characters, though Tanjiro's doesn't get into spoiler stuff, which does limit it a bit. And the fight is this really high-spirited battle of wits with only minimal bits of jank here and there, more than outweighed by the mostly pretty funny and charming dialogue, some of the best visual effects in the Sprite episode, and some top-tier voice acting. Benji Buckley does especially well as Jonathan. The overdrive screams in particular are only matched this season by Lanny as Vegeta, and the climax having the colour shifting used way better than Dio vs Alucard, as well as what I can only describe as the most JoJo thing I've ever seen with Jonathan moving his lungs to where Tanjiro's sword goes between them is so damn cool. Though I've not seen JoJo's, so if that's not the kind of goofy yet still super badass thing that goes on in that series, well, consider my interest in it down the drain. And of course there's the godlike Sunlight Yellow overdrive with one of the best screams in the series, and the really touching and emotional ending with the mercy kill, which does have those pacing problems I mentioned before, but I really don't care. This is such a good episode, one of my favourite Sprite fights in recent memory for that matter. I love me some character driven fights with some really somber endings. And funny thing is, that's not even the only episode this season those last 2 sentences apply to.
Hey, yo, DJ!
DGT the GOAT really went and had possibly the best writing debut for anyone on the show. I say possibly because I don't actually know what episodes people debuted on writing-wise and I can't be bothered to go out of my way and check. The analysis here is arguably the strongest of the season, going over the history and powers of both in a really interesting way. Bringing up real-world political figures for an X-Men character feels like a really fitting way to handle that end of Marvel, and I like how they cover both versions of Tetsuo's story. Any episode that can also justify having a golden tree situation gets it extra points. It was definitely for the better that the breakdown of Tetsuo's Big Bang feat was saved for the conclusion. And the fight continues with having one of the best scripts in recent memory. Though I don't want to sell the animator short at all because the animation is incredibly fluid and has some fantastic body horror in the hand-drawn stuff. There are like a few slow patches, but really nothing here is actively bad. The writing and atmosphere of the fighter for this episode really excels though. The apocalyptic city setting was already pretty fitting given these two's main connections of being war revolutionaries, and the track only adds to that. Ego Death sets the dismal tone of the start perfectly, escalates to the pretty good backing track for the first portion of the fight, and gets way more intense when giant mutant baby Tetsuo comes out. Speaking of which, yeah, for as fun as the first half of the fight is, and as cool as the shot of the magnetic fields being distorted is, the fight really begins to shine towards the end. Tetsuo begging Magneto for help when he overmutates is really sad, and Magneto finally going all out to comply with his wishes is some great character work. He never wanted to kill this kid, especially he can see him mutating in front of his eyes, but he's willing to do what it takes to make the pain end for him. The fight with the buzzsaws is cool, Magneto harnessing the Big Bang and blasting Tetsuo with it is great, and I love that the killing blow is Magneto shutting off Tetsuo's brain as painlessly as possible, with Tetsuo's dying thought being to thank him now that he's finally at peace. It's some amazingly written stuff. God, this episode's so good. It was pretty neck and neck with Han Jojo and Harley Jinx for me for a bit, but the more I think about them, the more the gap continues to widen. And no, it's not just bias because I know the guy who wrote it. Still though, it's crazy to think that a few years ago I just knew DJ as the guy who worked on CX and not much else. And now look at us. Acquaintances. I'm sorry, that was mean. Love you, DJ.
Merry Christmas.
I am still so happy that Death Battle made me eat my words with Omni-Man vs. Homelander. I really don't think this episode would have been nearly as good if Nolan had fought Bardock instead. I knew the dialogue was going to be good just based on the nature of the characters and series involved, but I could have never expected it to be as good as what we got. Homelander's opening monologue giving us the best setup to a Death Battle ever, Nolan's tranquil fury, Homelander's eventual breakdown, it's all basically flawless. It extends beyond just the dialogue as well. While there isn't a whole lot of fighting, it's all still super well animated and makes the best possible use of their personalities and limited toolkits. Homelander isn't used to fighting someone his equal, so Nolan's superior stats and skill are worked into making this one of the only episodes I think pulls off being a stomp well, while also still letting Homelander get some good damage in with how his abilities specifically counter Nolan's weaknesses. The hand-drawn animation is excellent, especially the ending with that silhouette shot and the unreal amount of gore. The death is incredible, the characterization of both characters is handled basically perfectly and makes even more sense in retrospect after Homelander got his ass kicked a few episodes later in the show. The track is one of my new favourites that I've listened to more than any others in the last year besides Hollow Dreams. The analysis feels like a sufficient covering of the characters despite not delving too much into spoilers. It's just a top tier episode on all fronts. You know what the most glaring negative aspect of this episode is that I didn't mention in my initial review? The plane here's moving kinda slow and the explosions keep going even after it completely falls off screen. Yep, that's the level we're at. The rest of this episode's issues are still all super minor, and are more so aspects that I think could have been done better rather than things they outright fucked up on. Like Homelander's body not being distorted in the opening rushdown, and Nolan not audibly reacting most of the times he got hit. My biggest negative takeaway from this episode was, again, the waiting period being obnoxious with the influx of "Lamal, this aged well" comments on that one video that I did. But if I were to start judging episodes based on how I felt during the waiting period, then half of the season would suck and this one wouldn't even be in the bottom 3. So yeah, god damn man, I don't even know what else to say. This is basically everything I could have wanted in an episode like this, and it is running laps around the rest of this already amazing season. It's still gatekept out of my top 10 and even top 15 by the amount of episodes with similar or even better peaks, which also have more going on generally, but make no mistake, this is still a top tier episode that holds up every time I go back to it. I don't think it quite surpasses last season's peaks. I still enjoy Yoda vs Mickey and Dio vs Alucard more, and Saitama vs Popeye ratios all three of them, but honestly this gets damn close to the level those first two are on. And if you've heard how much I've gushed over Yoda vs Mickey and Dio card, then you'd know that is some seriously high praise. This is the episode to beat, and I hope they can do it at some point this season. With only one exception, every episode this season has been really good so far, and we could be looking at my new favourite season if the second half keeps up the same level of quality. Hopefully you all enjoyed this video, I'll see you in the next one.